Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I never knew, never suspected, but everything changed that rainy afternoon. I was going through some old boxes in the attic when I stumbled upon something that didn't belong. It was a suitcase, a large one, tucked in the back corner. I hadn't seen it before, and something inside told me to open it. My hands trembled as I unzipped it, and there, staring up at me, was a fur suit. An elaborate costume of an animal. My heart skipped a beat. Was this some weird joke? I turned it over and found even more. Tails, ears, gloves, everything. I couldn't make sense of it. My mind raced. I rushed downstairs, my thoughts a jumbled mess, and there he was, sitting calmly, as if nothing was wrong. "What is this?" I asked, holding up the furry costume. His face drained of color, and in that moment, everything changed. It wasn't just the suit that shocked me. As I began digging through the suitcase, I found more photos, books, and a journal. At first, I thought it was some sort of weird fetish or phase he was going through. But the photos told a different story. He wasn't just playing dress-up. He was performing. There were shots of him at conventions, large furry gatherings, surrounded by others in full costume, smiling, laughing, in the company of people who looked like they understood him. My stomach twisted. How could I not have noticed this? How could he hide something so big from me for so long? I confronted him, but he was calm, too calm. "It's nothing, just a hobby," he said. But the way he avoided my gaze told me this wasn't just some passing interest. This was a secret he had been keeping for years. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a hobby. His reluctance to talk about it only made me more suspicious. He kept saying it was no big deal, but the more I dug into the suitcase, the more I realized it wasn't just a hobby at all. It was a lifestyle, a whole other life. And it wasn't just about the costumes. There were social media accounts with thousands of followers, videos, messages, blogs. He wasn't just participating in furry conventions. He was an influencer, someone people looked up to. And that hit me hard. My husband, the man I thought I knew, was living this secret double life. He wasn't just attending these events. He was a star in that world. And I had been kept in the dark. I was beyond confused. My head spun as I continued to piece things together. He'd been attending these conventions for years, but not just for fun. He was networking, building an audience, creating an alter ego, a persona, I would later learn. He had a whole following. Fans who adored him, who looked up to him as a furry influencer. At first, I couldn't understand it. How could he keep something like this hidden from me? How could he live this double life without me knowing? I started going through his social media accounts, each more elaborate than the last. His followers weren't just fans. They were his friends, his family in a way. They celebrated him, shared his posts, and adored his furry persona. I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. Who was this man? This wasn't the husband I had known. This was someone else entirely. The more I discovered, the harder it was to believe. I came across an old video, one he had made years ago, showing him fully dressed in his furry costume, talking to a camera. He was laughing, explaining what it meant to him to be part of the furry community. And there, in that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before. True joy. A joy that I had never felt from him in the years we'd been together. He was free, he was alive, and in his world of fur, he was important. But why was I never a part of it? Why had he hidden this side of himself from me? I was torn. On one hand, I was furious. On the other, I was heartbroken. He had built a life I wasn't part of, and I didn't even know how to confront him about it. How could he choose a life of secrecy over me? That night, I asked him point blank, "Why didn't you tell me?" He seemed taken aback, as if the question was something he hadn't prepared for. He fumbled for words, but there was nothing convincing in his response. "I didn't think you'd understand," he said quietly, his voice trembling. My heart sank. Understand what? Was this a fantasy? A way for him to escape from his reality? Or was it something deeper, something intrinsic to who he was as a person? I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. This was a world I didn't know, one I wasn't invited into, and yet it had been a part of him for so long. It was as if he had been living in two separate realities, one with me and one with the furries, and I was only a bystander in both. And now, the man I thought I knew was a stranger to me. As the days wore on, I began to feel like a detective in my own home. I started poring over his messages, those private conversations he had with other furries, some of whom were strangers, others were longtime friends. The comments were mostly harmless, but there were hints of something more. A level of intimacy I didn't share with him. People were complimenting him, calling him king, the best furry, and amazing. I didn't know how to process it. Was this just harmless fun? Or was it something deeper? I had never seen him interact with me in such an open way, and now here were these strangers, practically worshipping him. I started feeling jealous, not of the furry world itself, but of the way he was treated in it. It was as if I was invisible and this persona, this furry version of him, was the one everyone adored. How could he have hidden this for so long? The more I delved into his furry world, the more questions I had. The messages from fans, the love letters, the constant admiration. It was all so overwhelming. I had never felt this distant from him before. He was no longer the quiet man I married. He was the charismatic and adored furry king to an entire community of people. I wasn't part of it. I wasn't even invited to the table. And the more I watched him interact with them online, the more I realized something I hadn't seen before. He was living two completely different lives, and I was no longer at the center of either. I wasn't sure who I was in his world anymore. Was I his wife, or was I just an outsider? I wanted to know what kept him so invested in this alter ego, but whenever I asked him, he grew defensive. I felt lost, as if I were just a shadow in his life, one that had been forgotten. One night, while he was out of the house, I decided to take a deeper dive into his furry persona. I felt like I needed to understand it fully, to understand him. I started watching more of his videos, some of them old, some of them recent. There he was, in full costume, speaking to his audience, answering questions, laughing, connecting. He was so alive. And I wasn't even in the picture. The truth stung. His online fans knew him better than I did. They celebrated him, they appreciated him. And I was sitting there, in my empty house, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. He wasn't just hiding it from me. He was living in a completely separate world, one that I wasn't a part of. It was like I had been replaced. I wasn't sure what hurt more, his betrayal or my own inability to be a part of his real self. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. I had to know more, to understand what this furry life meant to him. So I decided to confront him, to demand answers. I waited until late one night, after he had returned from one of his secret meetings with other furries. I was anxious, heart pounding, but I knew I had to ask the tough questions. Why do you need this? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Why do you hide this from me? Why didn't you tell me the truth? He looked at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty, as though he wasn't sure how to explain something that had become such an intrinsic part of his life. It's not that simple, he said quietly. This is who I am. It's not just a phase or a hobby. It's a part of me that I've kept hidden because I was afraid of losing you. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. Anger, confusion, heartbreak. How could he think I would have left him over this? Or was there more to the story? As I sat there, listening to him speak about his furry world, I couldn't help but feel betrayed. He wasn't just hiding something small. He was hiding an entire life. A life that I didn't even know existed. How could he have kept this from me for so long? But then, in the quiet of that moment, I began to understand something deeper. This wasn't just about him keeping secrets. It was about him hiding himself. His furry identity wasn't just an escape. It was how he expressed a part of himself that he couldn't show in our world. He told me that in his persona, he was free. He didn't have to be the quiet, reserved man who had to conform to society's expectations. He was someone else, someone bold, confident, and admired. I realized that this alter ego had given him the freedom he had never felt in his own skin. But what did that mean for our marriage? Could I accept this? Could I understand it? Over the following days, I felt like I was drowning in my thoughts. I didn't know what to do, how to feel. On one hand, I was angry. How could he keep this from me? He had built this whole world in secret, and I had been oblivious. But on the other hand, I could see that this wasn't something he chose lightly. This furry life wasn't just a phase. It was an essential part of who he was. But what did that mean for me? For us? Was I just supposed to accept it, to embrace it, and let go of everything I thought I knew about our relationship? I started questioning myself. Could I live with the fact that my husband was a furry influencer, someone adored by thousands, while I felt left out of his true self? Was this something I could learn to accept, or was it a betrayal too deep to overlook? I tried to stay calm, to process everything without making any rash decisions. But it was hard. The more I thought about it, the more I questioned the foundation of our relationship. I had always believed in transparency, in honesty, but here I was, staring at a life my husband had been hiding from me. His furry world wasn't just about fun. It was about him, his needs, his desires, his identity. I began to feel as though the man I married no longer existed, replaced by this persona. And yet, despite the hurt and betrayal, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of empathy for him. How lonely must it have been, living a life with so many parts of himself hidden away from me. I knew we needed to have another conversation, one that would lay everything on the table, but I wasn't sure I was ready for what might come next. Could we really rebuild what had been broken? That night, we talked for hours. I don't even remember how the conversation started, only that we both spoke from the heart. For the first time, I truly understood what the furry world meant to him. It wasn't about escape. It was about belonging. For so long, he had felt disconnected from the world around him, unsure of where he fit in. The furry community had given him a space to be seen, to be appreciated for who he truly was. He had never felt that kind of acceptance in his everyday life, but he also admitted that he hadn't known how to share that side of himself with me. He was afraid I wouldn't understand, and maybe, deep down, he feared I'd leave him. It was an epiphany for me. I realized he wasn't keeping secrets to hurt me. He was trying to protect me from a part of himself he thought I couldn't love. After our heart-to-heart, things felt different, but not in a good way. I understood his need to be a part of the furry world, but I still couldn't reconcile the two versions of him, the man I married and the furry king he had become. I found myself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I wanted to support him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing him. Every time I saw him slip into his furry persona, I felt a pang of jealousy and loneliness. I wasn't part of that world, and I wasn't sure how to enter it. He kept assuring me that his love for me hadn't changed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. We were no longer just a married couple. We were two people living in different realities, and I didn't know if we could ever truly find common ground again. I decided to take a step back and observe, to see if my feelings would change over time. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't as big a deal as I was making it out to be. But the more I watched him, the more I realized that I couldn't ignore how deeply this furry life had become ingrained in him. It wasn't just something he did for fun on weekends. It was a part of who he was. It was almost as if he had two separate identities, the man I knew and the person he became when he was dressed as his persona. He told me he felt free when he was in costume, but I couldn't help but wonder, what did that mean for me? Did I have to accept his furry world as a part of our marriage, or was it something I could never truly embrace? And if I couldn't accept it, what did that mean for our future together? One day, I found myself at a breaking point. The tension between us had grown unbearable. I had tried to keep an open mind, to see things from his perspective, but I was struggling. His furry world felt like a barrier between us, a wall I couldn't climb. I had tried to involve myself, to be supportive, but every time I did, it felt like I was an outsider in his life. So, I asked him again, why couldn't he let me be a part of it? Why couldn't he share his true self with me, the way he shared it with his followers? He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he might finally admit the truth. But instead, he said something that stung. I don't think you'd understand. I don't think you could ever love this side of me. His words cut deep. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because, deep down, I wasn't sure anymore. Could I ever truly accept this side of him? The next few days were agonizing. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. It haunted me. "I don't think you'd understand." Those words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't escape them. I wanted to believe that I could accept him, all of him, but there was this nagging voice in my head telling me that I couldn't. How could I share a life with someone who had been living a double life? How could I love a person who kept such a big part of themselves hidden? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had been lying to myself. I wasn't just hurt by his secret life. I was afraid of it. Afraid that if I let him in fully, I might lose myself in the process. I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to embrace his world without losing who I was in the process. I couldn't keep pretending. I needed answers. So, I did something I never thought I would do. I decided to attend one of the conventions with him. He was hesitant, of course. He didn't want me to feel uncomfortable or out of place. But I insisted. I needed to see this world for myself, to understand what it meant to him. We arrived at the convention, and immediately, I was overwhelmed by the sights and sounds. People in elaborate costumes, talking, laughing, taking photos. It was like stepping into a different world. I could see how much this community meant to him. But as I watched him interact with others, his fans, his friends, his followers, I felt like an outsider. It was like I didn't exist in that space. He was the star, the center of attention, and I was just the woman on the sidelines. I had never felt so invisible in my life. The longer I stayed at the convention, the more the feeling of being an outsider grew. I watched him in his element, laughing and talking to others, and for the first time, I felt a sense of loss. I had always been proud of my husband, but here, in this furry world, he was a completely different person. People admired him, celebrated him, and he reveled in it. I stood on the sidelines, a stranger in his world. He tried to pull me in, introducing me to some of his friends, but I felt more isolated with every interaction. I didn't belong here, and the more I tried to fit in, the more alienated I felt. I wanted to understand, to be a part of this world that had consumed him, but I realized something crucial. This wasn't just a hobby for him. This was his identity, and I was struggling to accept that the man I married had been living a double life, one that I had never truly known. After the convention, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted permanently. It wasn't just the furry world that was dividing us. It was the realization that I had never fully known who he was. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that this alter ego, this furry persona, wasn't just a role he played. It was a lifeline. It was a place where he could be seen, loved, and accepted in a way he never felt in his everyday life. I realized that part of me had always assumed that marriage meant being everything to each other, that we would share everything, every piece of ourselves. But in his world, I wasn't everything. I was one of the things in his life, and it hurt more than I had anticipated. The question nagged at me. Could I ever love him fully if I couldn't embrace this part of him? We tried talking more, but each conversation felt like we were circling the same argument. I could see the pain in his eyes every time I mentioned how I felt like an outsider. He wanted me to understand, to see the beauty in what he had found in the furry community. And I tried. I really did. But it wasn't just about the costumes, the fans, or the conventions. It was about him being someone else, someone who didn't need to be perfect for the world to love him. He didn't need to be the quiet, reserved man who struggled to meet expectations. When he put on his persona, he was confident, bold, and adored. And in a way, I envied that version of him. I wanted to be the one who made him feel that way, but I didn't know how. And more than that, I wanted to be seen in his life, not as an accessory to his persona, but as his partner. The line between love and resentment was growing thin. One evening, after yet another long conversation about his furry life, I decided to try something different. I asked him if he would let me see his furry side in a way that felt personal to me, not as an outsider, not as his wife who was trying to understand from a distance, but as someone who could be a part of it. He agreed, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked. And for the first time, I felt like I was seeing him as a person, not just his alter ego. I wanted to experience it, to meet the version of him that I had never been a part of, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand. So, He agreed to show me a side of himself I had never seen before. He sat down and told me about his journey in the furry community, the highs, the lows, the friendships, and the struggles. And for the first time, I felt like I was truly with him, not just beside him. As I listened to him speak, something in me shifted. I began to see him not as the man who had kept secrets from me, but as someone who had been carrying a heavy weight alone. The furry world wasn't just an escape. It was his way of finding freedom. He had been holding onto this identity, this part of himself, because he didn't know how to share it without fear of rejection. And I realized that the problem wasn't his furry life. It was the way I had reacted to it. I had made it about me, about my own insecurities and my own fear of being replaced. But he wasn't asking me to replace his world. He was asking me to be part of it. As he spoke, I started to understand that love, true love, was about acceptance. It wasn't about trying to fit into someone else's world. It was about making space for both of your worlds to exist together. I think that was the turning point for us. When I stopped seeing his furry persona as a threat, when I stopped viewing it as something that was taking him away from me, things started to change. It wasn't easy. We had a lot of hard conversations, and there were moments when I felt like I couldn't do it. But the more I got to know the man behind the persona, the more I realized that this was part of who he was, just as much as the man I had fallen in love with. It wasn't about choosing one version of him over the other. It was about both. I began to see how this world had shaped him, how it had helped him grow, and how it was a part of the person I had married. It wasn't perfect, but maybe love didn't have to be. Maybe it just had to be real. It wasn't long before I began to get more involved in his world. I attended another furry convention, this time as his partner, not an outsider. He introduced me to his friends, people I had seen in photos and messages, but now I was part of the group. It felt strange at first, like I was wearing someone else's clothes. But as the night wore on, I found myself laughing, talking, and even taking photos with his friends. It wasn't as foreign as I had imagined. I still wasn't completely comfortable, but I was willing to try. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was sharing a piece of him that had been kept hidden for so long. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting against it. I was just there, learning, adapting, and understanding him in a way I never had before. With each passing day, I found myself growing more comfortable in his world. It wasn't perfect, but we were finding a rhythm, a balance between our two realities. I could see the joy in his eyes when he talked about his furry community, and for the first time, I didn't feel threatened. I began to understand that his love for the community wasn't a reflection of something missing in our marriage. It was just another layer of who he was. The more I embraced it, the more I saw him in a new light. He wasn't hiding from me. He was just holding on to a part of himself that he feared I wouldn't understand. And maybe, just maybe, I had been the one who was afraid all along. Not of his furry world, but of the changes it might bring to our life together. Could we truly find a way to merge these two worlds? Was it even possible? One night, he sat me down and told me something that made my heart stop. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he said, his voice soft and almost hesitant. "I think it's time to stop hiding." I stared at him, not understanding at first. "What do you mean?" I asked. He smiled gently, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I've been living two lives for so long, and I don't want to do that anymore. I want to be open with the world about who I am, furry side and all. But I want to do it with you by my side." My heart fluttered in my chest. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where we could finally break free of the lies and the secrecy. But at the same time, I felt a pang of fear. Would the world accept us? Would I be able to handle the scrutiny that would inevitably come? I knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew it was a step forward, for both of us. After that conversation, things moved quickly. He began to share his furry identity with a broader audience, his followers, his fans, and even some of his family members. At first, I was nervous. I didn't know how people would react, how they would view us. But to my surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were fascinated by the vulnerability he was showing, the courage it took to be so open about something so personal. And as for me, I found myself growing more confident, more comfortable with the whole situation. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I was making the right decision. But every time I saw the joy in his eyes, the freedom in his spirit, I knew I had made the right choice. It was like I had been holding my breath for so long, and finally, I could exhale. It wasn't just the world that had to accept us, it was also us. We had to learn how to navigate this new dynamic in our marriage. There were still awkward moments, times when I felt like I wasn't fully integrated into his world, but we were working through it together. We learned to communicate more openly, to share our fears and insecurities without judgment. I told him how it felt to be an outsider in his life, how I struggled with feeling like I wasn't enough. And he told me how it felt to live in fear of rejection, of never being fully seen for who he was. We both had our moments of doubt, but we also had moments of understanding. It wasn't about perfection, it was about acceptance. And slowly, we began to realize that love wasn't about fitting into each other's worlds. It was about creating a space where both of our worlds could exist side by side. As time went on, I became more involved in the furry community. I didn't want to become a furry myself, but I wanted to understand it, to appreciate it in the way he did. I began to attend more conventions with him, but this time, it was different. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was a part of his life, a part of his community. People recognized me, greeted me warmly, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged. It was strange, being accepted in a space that had once felt so foreign to me. But with every passing day, I saw how much this world had shaped my husband, and I grew to admire it. It wasn't just about costumes and fun. It was about a group of people who had come together to create something special. And I realized that I had my own community, my own support system. We weren't so different after all. One night, after another convention, we sat in our living room, exhausted but content. He leaned over and took my hand, looking at me with a softness in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for accepting me, for being part of this with me. I never thought I'd be able to share this side of myself with anyone, but with you it feels right." His words made me feel a warmth I hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't just that I had accepted him. It was that I had embraced him, fully and without reservation. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were exactly where we were meant to be. Together, we had crossed a threshold, not just in our marriage, but in our individual lives. We were no longer living separate lives in the shadows. We were living our life, in the light, free from fear and shame. And that, in itself, felt like the greatest victory of all. As the months passed, I found myself learning more about the furry community than I had ever expected. I started to see the world through his eyes, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. We attended conventions together, met his friends, and even started making our own costumes. I could see how much joy it brought him, how the community had helped him find a sense of belonging that he had always craved. And for the first time, I understood why this part of him had been so important. It wasn't just a hobby. It was his way of finding a place where he could be free from the judgments and expectations of the outside world. I admired that freedom, that ability to embrace his true self without fear. It wasn't about the costumes or the persona. It was about the authenticity it gave him. Of course, it wasn't always easy. There were still people who didn't understand, who couldn't accept this side of my husband. We faced judgment from some of our friends and family members, and there were times when I wondered if it was all worth it. But in those moments of doubt, I looked at him and saw the happiness in his eyes, the way he came alive when he talked about his furry world. I realized that I had to be strong for both of us, not just for our marriage, but for the man I loved. He wasn't asking me to change who I was, to become something I wasn't. He was simply asking for my acceptance, my support, and my love. And that, I realized, was something I could give him without hesitation. No matter how hard it got, I knew we could face it together. I remember one evening, sitting on the couch with him, just the two of us. He turned to me with a serious look in his eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I thought it was something bad, but when he spoke, his words were filled with hope. "I've been thinking about making my furry persona more public," he said. "I want to share it with the world, to show people that it's okay to be different, that it's okay to embrace who you really are. I looked at him, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I knew this would be a big step for him, and it scared me. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something that reassured me. He wasn't asking for my approval. He was simply telling me what he felt. And in that moment, I knew that whatever decision he made, I would stand by him. With his decision made, things started to change for us. He began to post more about his furry life, sharing his experiences, his costumes, and his thoughts with his followers. He was more open about who he was, not just with me, but with the world. And as he grew more confident, so did I. I found myself becoming more vocal about our journey, more open to the idea of people knowing who we were as a couple, as individuals. It wasn't always easy. We faced criticism from people who didn't understand, but we also found support from others who embraced our openness. The more we shared, the more we realized that there was a community out there that accepted us for who we were. And for the first time, I felt like we were part of something bigger than ourselves. There was one particular moment that stands out in my mind, a moment that solidified everything for me. We were at a convention, surrounded by hundreds of people, all wearing their furry costumes, laughing and having fun. I looked over at him, at the man I had once feared would be too much for me to accept. And in that moment, I realized how far we had come. We had faced our fears, our insecurities, and our doubts. And now, here we were, together, surrounded by people who accepted us for who we were. I took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I love you," I said, my voice filled with emotion. "I love all of you." He smiled at me, his eyes sparkling with happiness. "And I love you," he said, his voice steady and sure. In that moment, I knew that we had found something truly special, something that no one could take away from us. As the months went by, we continued to navigate this new chapter in our lives. There were still challenges, of course. There were moments when I felt unsure, moments when I questioned whether this lifestyle was something I could fully embrace. But with each passing day, I found myself becoming more comfortable with it. I wasn't just supporting him anymore, I was with him. We shared this world together, and it had become a part of our marriage. We had learned to communicate better, to be open about our feelings, and to accept each other's flaws. The more we shared, the stronger our bond became. We were no longer two people living separate lives. We were a team, facing whatever came our way. I remember one night, after a particularly exhausting convention, we were sitting together in our hotel room. We were both tired, our costumes strewn across the floor, but there was a peacefulness in the air that I couldn't quite explain. We didn't need to say much. We were just there, comfortable in the silence. I looked at him and realized how much he had changed, how much we had changed. We had grown together in ways I hadn't thought possible. Our love had evolved, deepened, and become something that neither of us had expected. It wasn't just about acceptance anymore. It was about growth. We were no longer the people we had been when we first started this journey. We were stronger, more connected, and more in love than ever before. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. My husband received a message from a fellow furry influencer, someone who had been following his journey for a while. They asked him to collaborate on a project to create a series of videos about the furry community. At first, he was hesitant. He didn't want to make it feel like we were doing this for fame or money. But after discussing it, we both realized it could be a way to share our story, to show others that love and acceptance could be found in the most unexpected places. It wasn't about the costumes or the conventions. It was about the message. And together, we decided to take the leap. We would share our story, the story of how we had embraced each other's worlds, and how our love had thrived because of it. We dove into the project with enthusiasm, creating content that felt authentic to us. We filmed behind-the-scenes footage of conventions, discussions about the furry community, and even the making of our costumes. But the most important part of the project was our story, our journey from skepticism and fear to acceptance and love. We shared the struggles, the doubts, and the moments of growth. As we edited the footage together, I realized just how far we had come. This project wasn't just about sharing our world. It was about showing people that love is complicated, messy, and beautiful in all its forms. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours. and we were ready to share it with the world. The first video went live, and to our surprise, the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to tell us how much our story had impacted them. Some had struggled with their own identities, others with their relationships, and many with societal expectations. The message was clear. We weren't alone, and in a way, neither was anyone else. As we read the messages, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just in my husband, but in us, in our ability to navigate a world that often felt hostile to anything different. We were making a difference, even if it was in small ways. But it was enough. It was everything. As the project continued to gain traction, we began to hear more stories from people who had faced similar struggles. Some had been hiding parts of themselves for years, afraid of what others might think. Some had been in relationships where they felt like they couldn't be fully themselves. And some were just beginning to explore their identities and what that meant for their futures. It became clear that our story wasn't just about us. It was about everyone who had ever felt misunderstood or rejected. And as we continued to share, to engage with others, I realized that the world wasn't as judgmental as I had once feared. There was a place for everyone, a place where people could be seen for who they truly were. I wasn't just supporting my husband anymore. I was part of a movement, a community that was bigger than both of us. As the months went on, the project evolved. We started collaborating with other influencers, attending events together, and even participating in panels about self-acceptance and living authentically. It was surreal, in a way, to be standing on stages, sharing our experiences with hundreds of people. But with every step we took, I felt more and more confident. I no longer felt like an outsider in his world. I felt like this. Our story, our life, our love, was exactly where I was meant to be. We had found our place, not just in the furry community, but in the larger world. And as I looked at my husband, his eyes sparkling with excitement as he spoke to an audience, I realized that this was the man I had fallen in love with. Not the one who hid behind secrets and fear, but the one who was brave enough to show the world who he truly was. The more we shared our story, the more I realized how much our love had deepened. We weren't just sharing our lives with others. We were sharing ourselves, completely and without reservation. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, but they were fewer and farther between. We had built a foundation of trust and understanding that had become unshakable. I had learned to embrace his furry world, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And in return, he had embraced my world, my fears, and my desires. We had learned how to communicate in ways I never thought possible, how to support each other through the hardest times. It wasn't just about love, it was about partnership, and together, we were stronger than ever. There was a night, not too long ago, when we sat down to talk about the future. We had come so far, achieved so much, but the road ahead was still uncertain. What's next for us? I asked him, my voice soft. He smiled, his hand resting on mine. I think we keep doing what we're doing, he said. We keep being real, keep sharing, and keep growing together. But no matter what happens, we do it as a team. You and me always. His words filled me with a sense of peace, of certainty. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the future. We had been through so much together, and we had come out stronger on the other side. Whatever came next, I knew we could handle it. Together, our journey was far from over. Every day was a new opportunity to learn, to grow, and to love in ways we had never imagined. There were still moments of doubt, times when the weight of our decision felt heavy. But through it all, we had each other. We had the love that had been forged through adversity, and that love had become the foundation of everything we did. I no longer felt like I was living in the shadow of his furry world. I felt like I was walking alongside him, sharing in the joy and the struggles, the victories and the defeats. We were no longer just husband and wife. We were partners, equals, and best friends. And as we looked toward the future, I knew one thing for certain. No matter where life took us, we would always be ready to face it together. One of the most beautiful things I've come to realize through all of this is how much love can transform. At the start of this journey, I never could have imagined that our marriage would end up here, in a place where we were both fully ourselves, fully seen, and fully accepted. The person I am today, stronger, more confident, and more loving, is because of the experiences we've shared. The woman I was at the beginning of this story is a distant memory. I've grown, evolved, and become someone who understands the power of acceptance, not just for others, but for myself. And in doing so, I've discovered that the greatest gift of all is love, not the kind that tries to change someone, but the kind that allows them to be who they truly are. As the months passed, we found ourselves becoming more involved in the broader furry community. We attended conventions together, met new people, and even started hosting our own events. It was surreal, but it felt so right. The more we embraced this lifestyle, the more we realized how much it had shaped our relationship. We were no longer just surviving, we were thriving. We had created something beautiful, something uniquely ours. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments when I questioned the impact of all this on our future, but those moments were becoming fewer. Our love had grown stronger, our bond deeper, and the world seemed a little less intimidating. Together, we could face anything. One evening, after a particularly successful event, we sat on the couch together, exhausted but happy. He leaned over to me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a while, pure gratitude. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I looked at him, my heart swelling. "I never thought I could be this happy either," I replied. It was in that moment that I realized how far we had come, not just in the furry community, but in our marriage. We had gone from a place of confusion and fear to a place of mutual understanding, acceptance, and joy. And in that space, we had found something even more important than love. We had found peace. As our influence in the furry world grew, we started to receive more attention. At first, it was just online messages and comments, but soon, we were invited to podcasts, interviews, and even television spots. It was overwhelming, but it also felt surreal. This was no longer just about us. It was about representing a community, about showing the world that being true to yourself was worth it. But it wasn't always easy. There were moments when the pressure felt too great, when I worried that we were losing the intimacy of our journey. But every time I looked at him, I remembered why we started this in the first place. To be seen, truly seen, for who we were, and to show others that they, too, could find the courage to embrace their authentic selves. And as long as we stayed true to that mission, I knew we were on the right path. Life outside of the furry world wasn't always as kind to us. There were still people who couldn't accept our lifestyle, still those who saw us as odd or strange, but what had once bothered me no longer held the same power. We had learned to build our own definition of success, one that wasn't based on approval from the outside world, but on the love and respect we had for each other. I had stopped seeking validation from people who would never understand. Instead, I started to appreciate the quiet moments we shared, the late-night conversations, the small victories, the joy in each other's company. Those moments were more than enough. They were everything. As we continued to grow, we realized that our journey wasn't just about us anymore. We had become a symbol for others, a beacon of hope for people who had spent years hiding parts of themselves out of fear. Our platform became a place for others to share their stories, to connect, and to find community. I started to receive messages from people who had been inspired by our courage, who had found the strength to embrace their true selves because of us. It was humbling, to say the least. What we had done, what we had created, was more powerful than either of us could have imagined. And with every new story, every new connection, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't known before. We weren't just sharing our lives. We were changing lives. One day, I sat down and thought about everything we had been through. The doubts, the fears, the moments of uncertainty. I realized that every step had been worth it. We had created something beautiful out of what had initially seemed like a mess, a complication. Our relationship was stronger than ever, our connection deeper, and our love more profound. I had grown in ways I never thought possible. I had learned to accept not just my husband, but myself, to love all the parts of me that I had once tried to hide. And I realized that it wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fitting into someone else's idea of who we should be. It was about finding peace in who we were, about being at home with ourselves and each other. That was the greatest gift we could have given ourselves. We had come so far, but there were still moments of doubt, of fear, of uncertainty. The world wasn't always kind, and people still didn't always understand. But that didn't matter anymore. We had each other, and we had learned that the only validation we needed was from ourselves. We had built something beautiful, a love that was strong, authentic, and unshakable. Together, we had created a space where we could be truly free, where we could express ourselves without fear. And as we stood on the stage at another convention, hand in hand, I realized that I was exactly where I was meant to be, with him, in this world. And I wouldn't change a thing. The next chapter of our lives wasn't written yet, but we knew one thing for sure. We would face it together. Whatever challenges came our way, whatever obstacles we had to overcome, we would do it as a team. We had learned the power of vulnerability, the importance of acceptance, and the beauty of love that was free from judgment. And that was the foundation of everything we had built. Our journey wasn't just about embracing the furry world. It was about embracing each other, fully and completely, and finding the courage to be seen in a world that often asks us to hide. I knew that no matter what the future held, we were ready. Because as long as we had each other, we could face anything. As time went on, our influence continued to grow, and so did our understanding of each other. We had become more than just a couple in the public eye. We had become advocates for authenticity, for truth in a world that often demanded conformity. I found myself reflecting more on the journey we had taken to get here. It wasn't just about the costumes or the furry community anymore. It was about breaking down barriers, about showing the world that it was okay to be different, to embrace your quirks and imperfections. And it was okay to love those differences, even when they seemed so strange or out of place. We were no longer hiding. We were living, and in the most honest, raw, and beautiful way possible. But with all the exposure came new challenges. There were still people who didn't understand, who judged us from the sidelines. And while it hurt at first, I started to realize something. Their opinions didn't matter. We were stronger than the hate. We had built something together that could never be broken by the ignorance of others. And what we were creating, what we had already created, was far more important than any judgment from the outside world. Every time I heard a negative comment or faced a new challenge, I reminded myself of that. We had fought hard to get here, and we weren't going to let anyone take that away from us. One night, after a particularly intense online exchange, I sat with him and just let out a long sigh. The negativity sometimes felt like a heavy weight on my chest. He took my hand, squeezing it gently. "You know, we've come a long way," he said, his voice calm but firm. "There will always be people who don't get it, but we can't let them decide how we live our lives. We've found each other, and we've found our truth. That's worth fighting for." His words always had a way of soothing me, of reminding me of the bigger picture. He was right. We had something that no one could take from us. Our bond was built on more than just shared interests. It was built on mutual respect, acceptance, and love. And that was a foundation that would never crack. The next few months were a blur of activity. We traveled for conventions, met new people, and continued to grow our platform. But the real transformation wasn't in the world around us. It was in ourselves. I had stopped questioning my place in his world, stopped wondering if I belonged there. Because I did belong. And not only that, but I had found my own voice, my own identity in the process. I was no longer just the wife who stood behind her husband. I was a partner, an equal, and someone with her own story to tell. Together, we had created something that went beyond just a shared hobby. It was a shared life, a shared purpose. It was a quiet evening when we looked back at everything we had done. Our life, our journey, the challenges we had faced. It all seemed like a dream. But the dream was real, and it had been ours from the start. As we sat together, reflecting on the past and the future, I realized how much we had transformed. We had gone from a place of uncertainty, where we both feared being judged, to a place where we could stand tall, proud of who we were and what we had built. I wasn't just supporting my husband anymore. I was living my truth, too. And together, we were unstoppable. One day, as we were filming a new video for our channel, I found myself overwhelmed with emotion. It wasn't just about the project or the popularity it had gained. It was about the journey we had taken together. The obstacles, the challenges, the fear, and the joy. I had come to understand that this journey was never just about costumes or conventions. It was about us, our love, our partnership, and our willingness to fight for each other, to fight for ourselves. I looked at him, my heart swelling with pride, and in that moment, I realized that this life we had built together was the greatest adventure of all. And it was just the beginning. After the video went live, the response was incredible. But it was no longer about the numbers or the attention. It was about the messages we received. People were opening up to us, sharing their stories of self-discovery and courage. It was humbling, in the best way possible. Our influence had become a platform for others to speak their truth, to step into the light and embrace who they were without shame. I realized that the work we were doing, the story we were telling, was bigger than just us. It was about creating a space where others felt safe enough to do the same. And that was worth everything. As we grew older, I began to reflect more on the life we had created. The years had been filled with so many challenges, but even more triumphs. The furry world was no longer just a place we visited. It was part of our life. It was part of us. And what I had come to realize was that this world wasn't the source of our strength. Our strength came from within, from the bond we had built, from the love that had weathered every storm. And no matter where life took us next, I knew that we would always have each other. We had built something unbreakable, a love that had transcended the expectations of others, and one that would last a lifetime,